Welcome back to Man vs. Meeple, the show where we talk about all things board game related. Today we're excited to bring you guys Dark Souls, the board game.
Prepare to die.
Yes, David and I are huge video game players. We have been our entire life. So it's exciting for us to see a lot of these video games that we've either played in the past or played now as adults. Yeah, I mean, come to a tabletop form.
Yeah, and you know that I'm pretty cynical about licensed games in general.
Yeah.
And I always approach them that way. This one I was particularly excited about because I think there's some unique things about the video game that I was very curious to see how they would implement on the table.
Yeah.
Just like Bloodborne last year. And I'm really excited to share what we think.
For you guys that don't know what Dark Souls is, it is a video game from Software. They publish on the Xbox and on the PlayStation.
Yeah.
It is a very punishing role-playing style game in which players are going to be taking a character and exploring these very dark medieval-style worlds. And the whole gist around the game is that you're going to be dying quite a bit. It's part of the game because the creatures that you're battling and the bosses and the mini-bosses that you'll be fighting are extremely hard. They have some really unique patterns in the way they attack and defend against the players.
Yeah, this is old-school video gaming for sure in a present-day form because you're going through... It's almost like putting quarters in the machine, except your quarters are your deaths.
Yeah. And
you go through, and what first starts out as an impossible situation then becomes easier with experience.
Yeah.
And they've really tried to implement that here as well.
The other unique portion about Dark Souls as a video game is that each time you die, the entire world repopulates, and you lose all the experience that you have collected and not cashed in. This game also takes that experience. You will be dying, returning to the bonfire, and reigniting your soul, but the experience that you've lost will stay in those rooms in which you'll have to go back and regather that experience.
Which is one of the most painful things about the video game for sure, is losing a ton of experience and trying to get back through the gauntlet, if you will, to try to get it.
So, they have tried to recreate that experience. Have they hit that goal? Let's talk to you guys about the components first and let you know our experience afterwards. Okay. So to start the game, it is a 1 to 4 player game. It takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours to play through it.
Depends on how quickly you die.
Yeah, you can play this game as just a standalone, in which you're just going through one mini boss and then fighting through a boss. You can also play as a campaign style game, in which you'll be playing over a course of several nights, gradually increasing the difficulty of the game by playing harder and harder mini bosses and bosses.
Yeah, and it's cool because the way they've structured that in the back of the rule book, they've set that up as though it's the experience of Dark Souls 1, 2, and beyond.
Yep. So each player is going to pick one of the 4 available characters from the base game. You have a knight, an assassin, a warrior, and then a herald. All these have unique starting equipment pieces. You'll have shields and swords and halberds and all those different types of things to use. Each of these characters has their own board, and on this board in the bottom right corner, you have an experience track or a tiered structure to level up your characters. The reason for this is that it allows you to equip better equipment through the course of the game when you find equipment.
Right, the equipment is tied to your statistics, just like most games. But your starting equipment, it's fair game, you can use that. But just about any other piece of equipment you're going to flip over, you will have needed to put some points into one characteristic or another. And you can kind of determine what route you want to go. Each of the characters have kind of some built-in strengths, if you will, where they can max out at a higher level than other characters.
And they're mostly determined by their starting equipment as well. So each of the players is allowed to hold equipment. You can hold either one double-handed weapon or 2 single-handed weapons. You'll be able to use both of those in every encounter that you have in the game. You can also have 1 piece of armor, and you have a backpack, which you'll be able to hold 3 other weapons. You also have some special abilities. You have a special ability in the upper left that can be used through a heroic token that can only be used once until you refresh at a bonfire or rest at a bonfire.
Or die.
You have an Estus flask that allows you to get rid of all the stamina and damage that you've taken in an encounter. You have a luck token, which allows you to re-roll 1 defense die, attack die, or dodge die in the game. And then you can grab embers. Embers are found in the equipment deck that you can find. So the game board itself, you always have a starting tile. In the starting tile, you'll never have to fight any enemies. You have the common items deck, plus it's mixed in with 5 cards from each of the players that are playing. Those are all mixed together, and these are things you can buy with the souls that you collect from the monsters that you defeat. You also have a spark token. The spark token is how many lives or deaths you're allowed to have before the game is flat out over.
Yeah, it represents the bonfire, if you're familiar with the game, in the games where you're going back, and like Jeremy said, if you die, it ticks down, and it depends on the player count, but you get so many sparks depending on the players.
Yeah, and if you're playing a standalone game, you get an X number of sparks, and that's it. If you're playing in a campaign, you can buy sparks by paying souls into it, so you can keep going through the campaign. You also have printed on the board, you have Andre. He's the giant who will allow you to buy the equipment, and then you have the Firekeeper. For those who are familiar, again, with Dark Souls, Firekeeper allows you to raise your levels on your tiers and your statistics. All right, so what you'll be doing is you'll be going out into the overworld.
Right.
The overworld is populated by cards, face-down cards, which are called encounter cards. There's 3 levels of encounter cards, and there's going to be 4 of them in any game that you play, 1 for each of the tiles that you'll be facing. The encounter cards that you're going to be using, either level 1, 2, or 3, are tied into the boss that you'll be fighting past the fog gate. In this case, we have the Boreal Knight.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's his bottom of his card determines which encounters we'll have leading up to him. You'll fight through all these locations. You'll defeat a mini boss, and then you'll put new locations in, and you'll fight through, and then you'll fight the main boss.
Yeah, typically. It's cool. Like Jeremy said, it's all triggered by that boss. Because at the beginning of the game, you select what boss you want to go after. You put them there towards the end after the fog gate, and it's going to keep the game fresh each time because it's different encounter cards go on here, and there's a giant stack of encounter cards to begin with. So you're going to be facing different things depending on when you play, except for during one game. Because like Jeremy said earlier, when you die or you refresh at the bonfire, the same counter will basically revitalize itself, and the enemies will come back.
So players will decide mutually where they want to go. When they go into a room, they will turn over that encounter card, and it'll tell you spawn points for the enemies that will be in there. You'll gather those different types of cards. For instance, in this first room, we have hollow soldiers. They'll populate in those particular nodes. You'll see around the board nodes on each of these different locations. These nodes can hold 3 characters or 3 figures per area. It'll also tell you on here if there's any traps to be set up and if there's any obstacles to be set up as well in that room. Once the room is populated, players are allowed to move in. The player that opened up the room will become the aggroed player. So all the attacks initially will come towards that player. They'll also populate their own nodes with the characters moving in closest to the door. So they'll have to go on one of the 3 nodes that are available, or the open nodes for those players. So, combat.
Yeah, combat. There's a lot to say about combat. I think what would start off with is the turn structure.
Yeah.
The way this game works, once you encounter a group of enemies, it's one of those games where one player character takes their turn, then all of the enemies will take a turn, and back and forth and back and forth. So you can already tell they've set it up to be pretty punishing.
That's right. So, in turn order, a player, the first thing that happens in the room is that all the enemies will attack. They all have automated systems on the cards. They will tell you how much health they have, how much range they have. Either it's a 0 range, meaning that you have to attack in the same node that they're in, or 1 node away, and so forth. You also have how much defense they have, how much magic defense, because there's 2 kinds of attacks in the game. There's regular melee attacks, and then there's magic attacks. They have a dodge value. That dodge value is what you will need in order to dodge that character, and that's done by dice. And then you have program movement for the characters. Either they're going to attack and move, or move and attack. The movement is done by these things on the card. They're either going to move towards the closest or nearest enemy, or to the enemy that has the aggro.
Yeah, it's nice because it's not the same every time.
No.
And it really gives for a wide variety of gameplay because the enemies may, like Jeremy said, move towards the closest enemy. Or they might move towards the person with aggro. So the combat really, from the very beginning, becomes very tactical. More tactical than I really expected, and it's a good part of the flavor of the game.
Ties are broken by taunt levels. Each of the characters has a particular taunt level or threat level in the game. The higher a player with the higher threat level, those creatures will migrate towards those players. So, how combat works itself, when the encounters or the monsters do damage to the players, they have an inherent number of strength that they will do damage to that player. The player then gets to roll dice depending upon whatever equipment they have equipped. Some of the equipment that they have will allow them to roll dice. There's 3 types of dice in the game. There's black dice, which are the most common. Then there's blue dice, and then there are orange dice, which are the best dice.
Right.
And then there's a green die that is the evasion. So a player has to choose either to block the attack or to evade the attack. If they choose to evade the attack, they will roll X number of evasion according to the equipment that they have, but it's all or nothing.
Right.
If they miss the evasion, they take all the damage from that creature. If they block, they can block some of that incoming damage.
Exactly. When we played Jeremy's the Knight and I'm the Assassin doesn't start out with really much, if any, equipment that's going to allow for any blocking. Mm-hmm. So I was dodging all over the place, and it is very satisfying when you dodge, but it's also, like you said, extraordinarily punishing when you miss the dodge.
Let's talk about damage in this game, because this is one of the coolest aspects that we have found in this game.
Absolutely.
You'll notice there's a punch board on this. You have all the markers that will go in these locations for the upgrades, but across the bottom you have the stamina and the health. Stamina is represented by the black cubes. Black cubes or stamina allows you to use specific weapons in combat. On all your weapons in the game, you have line items on the bottom that say if you spend 0 stamina, you can roll X dice. If you spend 3 stamina, you can roll these dice plus a modifier, and so forth. Anytime you use stamina, either to move or to attack, you're going to place black tokens across this. Anytime you take damage, you're going to place red tokens in the other way. If at any time during the game, all of those locations are filled in with cubes, you die.
Right.
And that ends the encounter. One player can die in this, and that will completely end the encounter itself, and players will have to go back to the bonfire and refresh.
Yeah, and I can't stress enough how cool this dynamic is between the stamina and the health relevant to the game, the video game.
Yeah.
Because in the video game there's 2 meters, but the fact that they did a shared meter here really helps give that feeling of the balance between the stamina.
Flow,
Because when you've used all your stamina in the video game, you can't do much. You know, if you've exerted yourself, you're going to take a lot of hits. So you're more likely to die. That dynamic here, where you're deciding, should I push myself? Because if I do and take one little hit, I'm dead, is a really cool decision that you don't get to make in a lot of these games. Most of these types of games, you're like, okay, I'm going to attack, roll dice, see what happens. There's decision making here, and the dice are certainly not as sort of luck driven as you'd think.
Yeah, I want to address the die real quick. I do not like games that have a lot of heavy dice mechanics in the game that don't allow you to mitigate it. There's not a whole lot of mitigation in this game. However, there's only one blank space on any of the die, and that's on the black die, and there's a single blank space. Everything else is a hit. And your blue and your orange are all hits.
Right.
So you're always going to do damage, no matter what. It just depends on the amount of damage that you do. And again, you can kind of mitigate that by using higher powered weapons or using more stamina to power your weapons even more.
Yeah, when we found too, especially playing in a 4-player game, inevitably at least one of the players is going to get equipment that really beefs them up.
Yeah.
So even if you're suffering a little bit, you can kind of rely on each other to sort of, in a way, mitigate the overall situation, because you might not have the equipment yet, or you might not have been spending points to go up, because I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, but the souls that we collect are communal. So you decide as a group how you're going to share those.
Yeah, and also you get that feeling too. We had one player who upgraded their armor very well.
Oh.
So they would basically go
They were a tank.
and be a tank for the players. They would pull the aggro every time, and then they would roll, several blue dice and just negate all the damage to them.
Yeah.
So there is that communal feeling of cooperating to get through these areas. If you win the encounter, you will get souls times 2 for every enemy that you defeat in there. Those go to the pool over here. At that point, players can decide to come back and either buy new equipment, 1 soul per. They can also rest by clicking down their spark, but also refreshing any of the tokens that they used.
Right.
Or they can push forward. If they do rest and they decide to use one of their sparks, the room that they were in will refresh, and they will have to battle those, or can choose to battle those creatures again.
Yeah, and what's nice is even if you don't use a spark and refresh, all of your stamina and health will reset.
After every encounter.
So that you can at least plod on, because if it didn't, I can't imagine many players deciding to keep moving.
Yeah. Let's talk about the mini-bosses and the bosses. Once you decide as a group that you want to progress through the fog gate, you can push through those rooms and decide to fight a mini-boss. When you get to the mini-boss, a new tile will come out, and the mini-boss will be placed on that tile. There's also on the mini bosses and the bosses, there are an X number of cards that come with each of them. That's their attack patterns, basically. Usually there's 9 or 10 different cards, but they'll only bring an X number of those cards into the fight, and you don't know what those are going to be. However, in different locations on the map, you'll discover graves. Those will allow players, depending on how many graves you discover, to discover some of the cards that may be in their attack pattern. So what's going to happen here is they're going to add X number of cards. You'll look at however many you find by graves, and then you'll mix them all together, and you'll gradually start to discover the attack pattern of that creature, which is really cool because each of the different cards that they bring into the battle allow them to do different kinds of attacks.
Yeah, and Jeremy and I love when we see video game concepts brought to life this way.
Yeah.
And like the health and stamina meter, this is probably the other element in this game that I think is really cool and nails it, because we've always talked about boss fights in video games and how those could be represented. This is a great way, this whole attack pattern thing, because even if you don't have the information ahead of time, or much of it, you just have to go through his cards once to learn what the boss can do, and then figure out, okay, how are we going to position ourselves? And like I said earlier, the tactical feeling of this game is only amplified by those boss fights, because you're maneuvering around the boss. There's weak spots in some of them. I mean, it's a really, really cool boss fight experience.
And the bosses can also fire up. Once they hit a certain health threshold, they will introduce a new card. They will remix all of those attack patterns so you don't know the attack pattern anymore.
Yep.
And then they'll have a special ability that they can use through the rest of the fight. So they
just
become
like
increasingly
stage
harder.
2 of the boss fight, for
Exactly.
sure.
So that's basically the game. You're going to play through this once, or you can choose to play through it in a campaign. Now, if you choose to play through it in a campaign fashion, they've listed the bosses and the mini-bosses in the order that you want to fight them in, because they get progressively harder, and they bring harder encounter cards into each of the rooms. The ones we have faced so far have been pretty low-level stuff, but there are some high-level bosses on here that are really, really hard to churn through. Also, you will progress in the campaign. Anything that you've brought into one campaign, those weapons and items will follow you through. And that's great because there's a 60-card stack here.
Yeah, there's
a lot of items that you can get.
It's a lot of items, and I can tell you, it's not a lot of repeated things. In fact, I don't know if there's hardly any repeated things. It represents almost every item I've seen in a Dark Souls game.
Yep.
A lot of the pieces of armor. And again, we'll say this again when we get to the review. If you've played the game, there's so much about this that will be familiar and like, oh yeah, that weapon, I remember finding that when I played. A lot of that is in that stack.
And not only that, but the bosses drop weapons. When you destroy a boss, those weapons will be introduced. So you can find those weapons as well and equip those and use those through the course of the campaign as well. So let's get to the review.
Yeah.
I had huge hesitancy against this game for the fact that it uses dice rolling. I don't like games that use dice rolling for the combat because I feel like it's too luck driven. You don't know what you're going to get into. Once I found out, and this was, it was a great moment for me when I looked at these dice and I was like, there's only one side here to miss. All these are going to hit. So the experience for me just immediately got better.
Yeah. Well, and you always like, too, when there's a mix of dice and base levels of damage.
Yes.
Like you said earlier, the bosses they're going to do 5 points of damage. And then the dice are almost taking a little bit away from that.
Yep.
So I think the nice thing is the way they've made the dice work and the percentages they've used there, plus with the amounts of damage that both the players and the creatures do, it works out really well because you never feel like a complete and utter failure.
Yeah.
The dodging would probably be the only situation where you do that, but that's a risk that you're taking.
Yeah.
So it's really, really cool.
The other thing I really like, of several things, is that you can replay these rooms. If you so wish, you can flush all 4 rooms and then choose to come back and rest.
Kind of grind it out.
And grind it out, just like Dark Souls. You can grind out the souls to be able to upgrade your stats, which allows you to equip better weapon that you find and buy through the location deck. It feels like Dark Souls.
Yeah, absolutely does. And in fact, even just the sheer fact that you've gone through and you're familiar with what you're going to face and where they're going to be gives you that experience, just like the video game where you're like, okay, we know what's going to happen. We're going to be able to approach this better because we know what we're going to face.
Yep.
I don't know that you'd grind out too much. Like, I could see maybe a group going through all the rooms and then going through all the rooms one more time, and then probably the mini-boss. That's what we've done.
But you typically will have to grind a little bit because the bosses themselves are difficult. We're talking hit points of 1 to 5, maybe for the regular mobs that you have in the game. But once you get to the bosses, you're talking about 20s, 30s for some of these creatures.
And vicious attacks.
Vicious attacks,
Again, and you'll probably get sick of us saying this, just like the video game, Dark Souls is like, okay, you're going through, you get to the boss, die. You know? So, and that's very much how this has felt.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, you know what? Like I said earlier, the way this incorporates what we've experienced in the video game, probably my favorite thing about this. Like Jeremy, I was hesitant about this game. Not so much about the dice and the luck, but these are not generally my kind of game, or our kind of game for that matter. But so many of these miniature type games are coming out, and a lot of them end up boiling down to a lot of the same formula that we've seen. This one, the tactical aspect of how you're maneuvering in these rooms, I've never experienced anything like that. I'm sure there's probably some games out there that do that, but my love of Dark Souls combined with that tactical experience make this so much better than I expected. I really, really love this game.
So guys, we just got news that this is coming out and being released on May 24th to retail. I believe all the Kickstarter backers will get it very soon because it's now shipped to the backers. If this interests you at all, go check it out. It's a really, really good game. We highly recommend
absolutely.
it. If you guys have any questions, make them in the comments below. We've played it several times, so we can probably answer those questions for you. Subscribe to us, of course. Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. And everything else that we do here at Man vs. Meeple, and we will catch you guys next time.
Bye-bye.